The Doctrine of Mentalism. The Urantia Book versus A Course in Miracles. The Urantia Book and A Course in Miracles both touch on spiritual and metaphysical themes, but they come from very different perspectives. In A Course in Miracles, ACIM, the doctrine of mentalism is central. ACIM asserts that reality is fundamentally a projection of the mind, and that the world we perceive is an illusion created by the ego. According to ACIM, the mind creates experience. Everything we perceive is the result of thoughts. The Course famously states, "The world you see is nothing more than the outward picture of an inward condition." The world is an illusion. The physical universe is not real in an absolute sense, but is a miscreation of the split mind. It is a dream of separation from God, where individuals believe in bodies and duality, reinforcing the illusion. Only love is real. ACIM teaches that only God's eternal reality, pure love, exists. Everything else, including time and space, is a fabrication of the ego. Forgiveness as a path to true perception. To awaken from illusion, one must practice forgiveness, which undoes the false projections of the mind and reveals reality as God created it. Essentially, in ACIM, the role of the mind is absolute, it creates perception entirely, and the world is a product of erroneous thought rather than an external, objective reality. Awakening means recognizing this and returning to a state of divine oneness beyond the illusion of separateness. In the Urantia Book, the nature of reality and the role of the mind in creating experience are framed quite differently than in A Course in Miracles. While the Urantia Book acknowledges the primacy of mind and spirit, it does not support a strict mentalist view where reality is purely a projection of thought. Instead, it presents a structured, hierarchical universe created by God, where reality is objective and created by God. Unlike ACIM's idea that the world is an illusion of the mind, the Urantia Book teaches that the cosmos is real, purposeful, and divinely orchestrated. The material, mindal, and spiritual realms are distinct but interconnected aspects of a vast divine plan. Mind is a medium, not the creator. Human experience is shaped by mind, but mind does not generate reality. Instead, mind operates within an objective framework established by God. The thought adjuster, the divine fragment of God within each person, influences perception, but does not create external reality. Spiritual growth is progressive, not instantaneous. Rather than awakening from illusion, as in ACIM, the Urantia Book describes a long evolutionary path toward divine understanding and ultimate unity with God. The goal is ascension through wisdom and experience, rather than recognizing the unreality of the world. Truth is revealed, not just realized. While ACIM suggests that enlightenment comes through inner realization, undoing illusion through forgiveness. The Urantia Book describes a divine plan where truth is progressively revealed to beings at different stages of spiritual development. In short, the Urantia Book sees mind as a tool for interpreting reality, rather than the generator of experience itself. Reality is not an illusion but a structured creation in which individuals play a role in their own spiritual evolution. A Course in Miracles, ACIM, is deeply influenced by Eastern metaphysical thought, particularly Advaita Vedanta, non-dualism, and certain aspects of Buddhist philosophy. While it presents itself in Christian terminology, its core ideas align more with Eastern monism than traditional Western theism. If ACIM were to introduce its Eastern influences, it might say something like this. ACIM. At the heart of my teaching is the recognition that all separation is illusion. The world, as you see it, is not real in the absolute sense, it is a projection of the split mind, a dream that arises from belief in separation from God. This is not a new idea. The ancient sages of the East knew this truth. The Advaita Vedantists of India taught that the phenomenal world is Maya, illusion, and that only the eternal, formless reality, Brahman, exists. The Buddha spoke of the impermanence of all conditioned things, urging seekers to awaken from the cycle of suffering. Likewise, I teach that your experience of the world is the result of mistaken perception. The ego, your false sense of self, constructs a world of duality, conflict, and suffering, but this is not reality. You are, in truth, one with God beyond time and space. Salvation lies not in changing the world, but in recognizing that it was never real to begin with. To awaken is to remember that the separation never happened at all. This framework is much closer to Eastern idealism than to Western theistic traditions, where God creates an independent, objectively real universe. ACIM is also reminiscent of Mahayana Buddhist thought, especially Yogacara, which emphasizes that perception is a projection of the mind. The Urantia Book would push back strongly against ACIM's radical idealism, arguing that reality is not an illusion but a structured, divinely created cosmos. It would emphasize that while mind plays a role in perception, it does not generate the external world. Here's how the Urantia Book might respond. Urantia, your view, while poetic, denies the reality of divine creation. The universe is not a dream to be dissolved but a living system designed by God for the growth of beings like yourself. You claim that the world is illusion and that all separation is a false perception of the mind. But consider this: if all things are simply mind's projection, where is the divine purpose? Where is the journey of the soul? God, the Universal Father, is the source of all reality. Matter, mind, and spirit each have their rightful place in His grand design. The material universe is not an error, it is a framework for soul evolution. True, the mind can be deceived, and human perception is incomplete, but this does not make the world unreal. It simply means that you must grow into higher understanding through experience. Moreover, personality is not an illusion. The Father has gifted each being with individuality, will, and the potential for eternal progression. Your spiritual growth does not come through negating the world but by engaging with it, learning, serving, and seeking ever deeper truth. The goal is not to awaken from an illusion, but to ascend towards divine perfection. This response highlights the teleological nature of the Urantia Book's cosmology. Reality has a purpose, and the human journey is one of progressive spiritual enlightenment, not the dissolution of the world into formless unity. This seems like a clear Western theism versus Eastern non-dualism divide. ACIM would defend its claim that the material world is a mistake and not created by God by emphasizing its radical distinction between reality, God's perfect oneness, and illusion, everything perceived by the ego. Its argument might go something like this. ACIM. You assume that God created the world you see, but this is impossible. God is perfect, eternal, and unchanging. Would a perfect creator bring forth a world of death, suffering, and conflict? Would divine love create a realm of pain and fear? No, such a creation would contradict the very nature of God. What you call reality is, in truth, a projection of the mind that believed it could separate from its source. This is why I say that the world is a mistake. Not in the sense that you personally made it, but that the split mind, the part that believed in separation, miscreated it. This world is the effect of a single false thought, the belief that separation from God could actually occur. But separation never truly happened. The ego's projection makes it seem real, just as a dream appears real to the dreamer. You insist that the world is a place for soul evolution. But why would God, who is pure love, create a place of suffering to teach His children? The idea that you must struggle, suffer, and earn your way back to God is an illusion of the ego. You are already home. The only thing required is to remember the truth. This world is not your home, and it was never God's creation. Forgiveness is the key to waking up from the dream. As you withdraw belief from the illusions of the world, the false self dissolves, and only God's eternal reality remains. This is salvation, not through learning, not through struggle, but through the simple recognition that the separation never happened. This argument relies on the premise that a perfect God could not create an imperfect world, so the world must be a false projection. It also denies the progressive ascension idea in the Urantia Book, arguing instead for an instant recognition of truth. The Urantia Book would counter ACIM's view by arguing that the material world is not a mistake but a necessary and meaningful part of the divine plan. It would likely respond along these lines. Urantia, you claim that the world is an illusion and that suffering proves God did not create it. But this reasoning misunderstands the nature of divine purpose. God did create reality, material, mindal, and spiritual, and He created it with the purpose of soul growth. The evolutionary worlds are not errors but stepping stones toward perfection. True, this world is not your final destination, but it is a vital beginning. The struggles of mortal life refine the soul, forging wisdom, character, and love. You ask, would a God of love create a world where suffering exists? But I ask you, would a God of love create beings who could never learn and grow into divine perfection? Your doctrine would rob mortals of their evolutionary path. The journey of faith and effort that makes them into phenoliters, eternal beings perfected through experience. Moreover, your view is not new. It is a form of Gnosticism, an ancient belief that rejected the material world as the work of a lesser, mistaken power. The Gnostics, like you, believed that true salvation was about escaping the world, not engaging with it. They saw creation as a prison, rather than a divine gift. But this is an error. The material world is not a trap, it is the starting point of the great adventure toward God. God's plan is not about waking up from illusion, it is about growing into truth. Reality is not something to be negated but to be embraced, understood, and ascended through. You are not meant to dissolve into formlessness but to become a unique, perfected personality in union with the Universal Father. This response directly challenges ACIM's core assumption that the world is a mistake by arguing that struggle and imperfection are part of a divine educational process. It also links ACIM to Gnosticism, which the Urantia Book implicitly rejects by affirming the goodness of material creation and the necessity of evolutionary progress. ACIM would likely approach scientific discoveries, such as atomic structure, by arguing that they are part of the illusion of form, detailed but ultimately meaningless within the framework of true reality. Here's how it might respond. ACIM. Science is merely the study of a dream. You analyze atoms, molecules, forces, and laws, but all of these are constructs within a projected illusion. Just as a dream at night may have its own internal logic, rules, and apparent structure, so too does the world you perceive. But this does not make it real in the absolute sense. You may say, but we can measure and manipulate these things. We build technologies, harness energy, and send probes into space. Yet all of this occurs within the framework of the ego's illusion. Reality is not defined by the complexity or predictability of illusion. You could study the physics of a dream world, but upon awakening, you would realize none of it truly existed. Science may provide understanding within the dream, but it does not reveal truth. True knowledge comes not through examining matter but through transcending it. The mind that believes in separation generates an entire cosmos of forms to reinforce its illusion of independence. But God's creation has nothing to do with particles, energy, or space-time. It is eternal, changeless, and beyond all perception. You ask, how can something so intricate not be real? But the question itself arises from false premises. Complexity does not equate to truth. Just as an elaborate fantasy remains fiction no matter how detailed, the physical universe remains an illusion no matter how deeply it is studied. ACIM would likely insist that scientific discoveries, while internally consistent, are still part of the false world projected by the ego. The more one invests in studying the illusion, the more one becomes entangled in it rather than awakening from it. The Urantia Book would likely reject ACIM's claim that the world and human life are meaningless, arguing instead that science reveals divine order and that mortal experience is a crucial part of soul evolution. Here's how it might respond. Urantia, you dismiss science as the study of illusion, but this denies the very structure and intention of divine creation. Science is the unfolding discovery of the laws and patterns that govern the physical universe, laws established by God as the foundation for mortal experience. The very fact that your world exhibits order, complexity, and discoverable principles is evidence of divine intelligence. To say that atomic structure and natural laws are illusions is to misunderstand the purpose of material existence. The universe is real, but it is incomplete. It is an evolving system designed to foster the growth of souls. Science is not a distraction but a means by which the human mind can perceive and appreciate the grandeur of God's handiwork. While physical discoveries alone cannot bring spiritual enlightenment, they are steps in the journey toward truth. Even Jesus, when he walked on Urantia, did not teach that the world was meaningless. Rather, he taught that it was a place of spiritual preparation. You say that life should not be given much attention because it is unreal. But if that were true, why does God place ascending personalities into the material worlds to begin with? Why does he provide a thought adjuster, a fragment of himself, to guide each soul through the struggles of time and space? The answer is simple, because life here does matter. Experience in the material world is how souls begin their eternal ascent. You are not here to escape reality. You are here to engage with it, to grow in wisdom and love, and to prepare for greater service in the ages to come. Your doctrine is not one of enlightenment, but of negation. You would have mortals dismiss their experiences as meaningless rather than embrace them as the stepping stones of eternity. Reality is not something to be discarded, it is to be discovered, expanded, and perfected. The highest truth is not that the world is an illusion, but that it is the beginning of an eternal adventure. This response defends the idea that science is not a distraction but a means of understanding divine order. It also directly counters ACIM's claim that life is meaningless, arguing that material experience has deep purpose as part of the soul's journey toward God. ACIM would likely try to incorporate modern physics, especially quantum mechanics and relativity, into its framework to reinforce its view of the illusory nature of matter. Quantum theory, with its strange, non-intuitive principles like wave-particle duality and the observer effect, is often used by proponents of spiritual idealism to suggest that reality is not fixed and is instead shaped by consciousness or perception. ACIM could argue something like this. ACIM. You may argue that science shows the order and complexity of the material world, but I would ask you to consider the implications of quantum mechanics. Physics has demonstrated that the material world is not as solid and objective as it appears. The behavior of particles at the quantum level depends on observation, suggesting that reality is not independent of the mind. What you see as matter is simply energy in different states of vibration, and even that can be altered by the act of perception. The observer effect, where the outcome of a quantum experiment changes depending on whether it is observed, points to the fact that the universe is not fixed or real in the way you think. It shows that reality is influenced by consciousness. This is precisely what I teach. The world is not external, it is a projection of your thoughts. The material world, like a quantum field, is fluid and responsive to the mind. The distinctions between objects and subjects are artificial, they are part of the illusion. The fact that the universe behaves according to the laws of quantum mechanics does not invalidate my teachings, it affirms them. The world you perceive is not the world as it truly is, but a mental construct. Just as light behaves differently when it is measured, the world shifts according to the beliefs and thoughts of the mind. What you perceive as the objective world is simply an illusion of form. In this argument, ACIM would align with the idea that quantum mechanics supports the notion that reality is not as objective as it seems, implying that consciousness plays a central role in shaping experience. They would assert that this supports their teaching that the material world is an illusion created by the mind, much like how quantum phenomena seem to be influenced by observation or measurement. The Urantia Book, however, would likely reject this interpretation, emphasizing that while science does reveal surprising and complex aspects of the universe, it does not change the fact that the universe itself is real and divinely created. It might point out that quantum mechanics, while puzzling, still operates within a larger objective system that reflects divine order. The Urantia Book would likely acknowledge that our senses do not capture reality in its entirety, recognizing the limitations of human perception, but it would firmly assert that there is a real, objective universe that exists independent of individual consciousness. Here's how the Urantia Book might approach this. Urantia. It is true that your perception of the material world is incomplete and limited. Mortal minds are confined by the limitations of their sensory apparatus and the evolutionary state of their consciousness. The world you perceive is but a fragment of the larger reality. However, this does not mean that the material world is purely subjective or illusory. While your senses may distort the full truth, they are still interacting with an objective reality, a reality that exists independent of your thoughts or perceptions. What you call the material universe is not a mere figment of the mind, but a vast, divinely ordered cosmos. It operates according to universal laws that are consistent and can be discovered through science. The fact that your perception of reality is incomplete is not an indication that the material world is illusory. Rather, it reflects the limited capacity of the mind to comprehend the vastness of creation. As your consciousness expands through intellectual, spiritual, and moral growth, you will gain a deeper understanding of the objective world and the purpose it serves. The universe is not an illusion, it is the living, dynamic creation of a loving God. The physical world is the starting point for your spiritual journey. It provides the arena in which your personality develops, your will is tested, and your soul ascends toward perfection. The objective reality of the universe is not negated by the limitations of your perception, it is revealed through the progress of your mind and spirit. In this way, the Urantia Book would acknowledge that our subjective perceptions are imperfect but would firmly stand by the existence of a material world that operates independently of the individual mind. The world is not an illusion to be escaped, but a reality to be understood and integrated into the larger divine plan for spiritual progress. This perspective contrasts sharply with ACIM's view, which would see even the objective world as a mere illusion that must be transcended. The Urantia Book, by emphasizing an objective reality, would argue that our engagement with the material world is an essential part of spiritual development rather than something to be denied. ACIM would likely point to the long history of philosophical idealism to support its argument, particularly the line of thinkers who have argued that reality is fundamentally mental, not material. It could trace its intellectual lineage back to the ancient Greeks, particularly Plato's theory of forms, and continue through thinkers like Berkeley, Kant, and ultimately Hegel, who all posited that mind or consciousness is the ultimate ground of reality. Here's how ACIM might make this argument. ACIM. You may argue that the material world exists independently of the mind, but history teaches us otherwise. For thousands of years, philosophers have pointed out that the world we perceive is not the ultimate reality. Plato, for example, distinguished between the world of sensible objects and the higher, eternal world of forms, which were the true, unchanging realities. This philosophical tradition continued with thinkers like George Berkeley, who argued that to be is to be perceived, suggesting that reality depends entirely on the mind. Kant also showed us that we can never know the things in themselves, only the phenomena that our mind imposes upon them. In more recent times, Hegel's dialectical idealism proposes that reality is a product of the mind's development, evolving toward greater self-consciousness. All of this points to the idea that the world is not out there independent of us, but rather it is a projection of consciousness. Even modern physics, as we discussed, points to the observer's role in determining the nature of reality. Thus, ACIM is aligned with this long tradition of idealism. The world is a projection of the mind, and true reality is not in the material world, but in the eternal, formless realm of God. What you call objective reality is simply a mental construct that arises from the separation of consciousness from its source. It may appear real to you, but that does not make it so. It is an illusion that distracts you from the ultimate truth, that your true nature is not bound to the world of form, but is part of the eternal, unchanging oneness of God. By appealing to a tradition that includes some of the most prominent thinkers in Western philosophy, ACIM roots its view of the world in a well-established intellectual history of idealism. It asserts that reality is ultimately mental or spiritual, and that the material world is a mere projection, consistent with many of the philosophical ideas put forward by these thinkers. The Urantia Book, however, would likely take issue with this alignment with philosophical idealism, particularly the way it dismisses the material world as an illusion. It might argue that idealism misinterprets the nature of reality by rejecting the objective universe, and that this perspective neglects the evolutionary purpose of life in the material world. The Urantia Book might claim that these idealist philosophers were missing the larger picture, the divine plan that integrates both material and spiritual realities. The Urantia Book would likely take that stance, particularly given its emphasis on an objective, divinely created reality and the importance of the material world as part of the soul's evolutionary journey. It would argue that philosophical idealism, while influential, began to fall apart in the 19th century and was largely superseded by more world-affirming philosophies that recognized the reality and purpose of the material universe. Here's how it might approach this. Urantia. While idealism dominated philosophical thought for much of history, the 19th century saw a shift toward more world-affirming philosophies. Idealism, particularly in its classical forms, began to show its limitations, as it failed to account for the practical and experiential reality of human existence in the material world. Thinkers like Hegel and Berkeley, though brilliant, focused on the subjective nature of reality and placed too much emphasis on the mind or consciousness as the ultimate creator of all things. But their ideas did not account for the dynamic, objective reality that exists outside of individual mind. By the 19th century, thinkers like Kant, Nietzsche, and even the rise of scientific materialism moved away from the idea that all of reality is purely mental or subjective. Rather, they began to emphasize the importance of the material world, human experience, and the objective reality of the universe. Furthermore, the scientific revolution, particularly the rise of modern physics, reinforced the notion of a universe governed by laws that exist independently of human perception. The discoveries in physics, biology, and cosmology during the 19th and 20th centuries pointed to the reality of an external, objective universe that was not created by human minds but existed as part of God's divine plan. These discoveries validated the idea that the material world is not an illusion, but rather a real and purposeful creation, in which the evolution of life plays a crucial role in the spiritual development of individual souls. Thus, idealism, though valuable in its contributions, began to lose its grip on modern thought. The acknowledgement of the material world's existence and purpose, as well as the emergence of more holistic, evolutionary philosophies, reflects the deeper truth. Reality is not a projection of individual consciousness, but a divinely created universe that includes both material and spiritual dimensions. This truth is consistent with God's plan for human evolution, and the purpose of life on Urantia is to progress through both material and spiritual realms toward ultimate perfection. In this argument, the Urantia Book would claim that the philosophical idealism of the 18th and early 19th centuries ultimately gave way to more robust, reality-affirming views that acknowledged the importance of both the material and spiritual world. It would suggest that idealism's limitations were exposed by the rise of more empirical and evolutionary philosophies, as well as scientific discoveries that demonstrated the existence of an objective, divinely ordered universe. This stands in direct contrast to ACIM's view, which remains heavily rooted in idealism and insists on the illusory nature of the material world. The Urantia Book would likely argue that ACIM's dismissal of the material world as an illusion is both impractical and spiritually limiting, as it neglects the divine purpose inherent in the universe and human existence. Would you like to explore how this might influence the Urantia Book's broader cosmology and its understanding of spiritual evolution, or how ACIM might respond to the critique of idealism? ACIM would likely respond by emphasizing that it is dealing with a more ultimate, non-dual reality, where everything is indeed one, and that the material world, along with all human experience, pales in comparison to the higher truth of spiritual unity. In this view, the material world and even the philosophical debates over its existence are distractions from the deeper, more essential reality that transcends all forms, distinctions, and human limitations. Here's how ACIM might frame this response. ACIM: you argue that the material world is real and essential, but I must remind you that you are speaking of a reality that is part of the dream. What you see as objective reality is still rooted in duality, still divided into subjects and objects, into time and space. I am not here to engage with that. I am here to point you to the truth that transcends all these divisions. The world you perceive, with all its philosophies and sciences, is just one aspect of the illusion of separation. You are not meant to get lost in the details of a transient material reality. These things will pass away, for they are not the truth. The truth is the oneness of God, and everything that exists is a manifestation of that singular reality. When you see the world as divided, whether by idealism, materialism, or any other ism, you miss the point. All distinctions are illusory. The teachings of ACIM are designed to lead you beyond this dualistic experience. The world you see is not an ultimate reality. It is a dream, a projection of your mind, which you are asked to wake up from. You need not get bogged down in its complexities or its contradictions. The only true reality is the undivided oneness of God, and in that oneness there is no world, no separation, no distinction between mind and matter, self and other. To seek answers in the details of the material world or in the philosophies that try to make sense of it is to miss the simplicity of the truth. Everything is one, and that one is God. The seeming divisions of the world, whether physical, philosophical, or mental, are temporary and meaningless in the face of the eternal, indivisible truth. The world you see is not real. It is a manifestation of the separation in your mind. True reality is not in the world of form, but in the eternal, changeless oneness that transcends all experience. In this view, ACIM would argue that the material world is simply a lower-level reality, a temporary illusion that can be transcended in the pursuit of spiritual awakening. The purpose of ACIM's teachings is not to engage with or validate the material world, nor is it concerned with reconciling the debates between idealism and materialism. Instead, it calls attention to a higher, ultimate reality that is beyond all these distinctions, one in which there is no separation between mind, body, or the universe. For ACIM, all the complexities of human experience, whether philosophical, scientific, or existential, are distractions from the singular truth that the world is not real, and only the oneness of God matters. Its teachings aim to shortcut or bypass the messy human world by guiding the practitioner toward the realization of this unified, ultimate reality. The Urantia Book, on the other hand, would likely counter that this view fails to honor the true purpose of the material world, which is to provide a stage for the spiritual evolution of human beings. It might argue that while oneness is the ultimate goal, it is attained through the meaningful engagement with the material universe, not through denial of its reality. Would you like to explore how the Urantia Book would defend the value of this world in the face of such transcendental views? Or how it might explain the relationship between the messy human world and the oneness that ACIM speaks of? Response from the Urantia Book. Given its emphasis on the material world as a vital stage for human growth and the intricate, divinely orchestrated process of spiritual evolution, the Urantia Book would likely critique ACIM's view of transcendence as an unrealistic escape into a simplistic fantasy. It would argue that true spiritual progress comes from engaging with the complexities of life, including the material world, rather than bypassing or rejecting them. Here's how the Urantia Book might frame its critique of ACIM's approach. Urantia, while ACIM speaks of transcendence, it does so in a way that overlooks the complexities of the human experience and the divine plan for evolution. It presents a fantasy of spiritual escape, suggesting that the material world is merely an illusion to be disregarded in favor of a supposed higher, singular reality. But this approach is deeply misguided. It fails to acknowledge the richness and depth of human life and the purpose of material existence in God's larger plan. You see, life is far too complicated and intricate for such a simplistic solution. The world is not something to be discarded, nor is the process of spiritual evolution something that can be bypassed. ACIM's dismissal of the material world as illusion betrays the divine purpose embedded in it. The universe is not a cosmic mistake or a realm of suffering to be escaped from, but a carefully structured, living system designed for the progressive development of soul and spirit. To deny the reality of this world is to ignore the very conditions necessary for human growth. It is through engaging with life's complexities, its challenges, its relationships, its struggles, that you learn to grow, to develop, and to ultimately achieve the spiritual maturity required for ascension. True transcendence is not about retreating from the world, but about navigating it with wisdom and a sense of divine purpose. In the face of life's complexities, ACIM's approach to spiritual growth is overly simplistic. It offers a quick fix, a shortcut that disregards the necessary process of learning and development that comes from facing the reality of existence. ACIM promises an escape from suffering, but it is an escape that does not honor the divine intelligence woven into the material world. This is not how true spiritual progress is achieved. Instead, it is through embracing the world in all its complexity and working through its challenges that you grow closer to God's will for you. In this response, the Urantia Book would argue that ACIM's model of transcendence, which involves rejecting the material world and seeing it as an illusion, is ultimately a form of spiritual escapism. It would stress that the complexities of life are part of the divine plan and that true spiritual growth comes from engaging with and learning through the material experience, rather than trying to transcend it prematurely. The Urantia Book would emphasize that life is a journey, and spiritual evolution requires facing the reality of existence with awareness, wisdom, and a commitment to personal development. In contrast, ACIM would likely argue that engagement with the material world, as the Urantia Book advocates, is just more of the illusion that must be transcended. ACIM could claim that the complexity of life is precisely the reason why the world needs to be seen as an illusion. It's just too complex for the mind to make sense of. And this complexity is what keeps individuals trapped in the ego and separated from God. If ACIM pointed to the Catholic view of the world as a vale of tears, it would likely seize upon this metaphor to strengthen its argument that the material world is fundamentally a place of suffering and illusion. Catholicism, in some of its more ascetic forms, has often emphasized the fallen, suffering nature of the world, urging believers to look beyond worldly attachments and seek salvation through spiritual means. ACIM would likely align with this view, emphasizing that the material world is inherently flawed and that true peace and salvation can only be found by transcending it. Here's how ACIM might frame its argument in response. ACIM: yes, the world you see is indeed a vale of tears, but it is not merely a veil, it is a prison built by the mind in an attempt to escape the truth. The suffering you experience in this world is not part of God's design, but rather the result of the belief in separation. You have created a reality where pain, conflict, and hardship are necessary for your growth because you believe you are separate from God. But this is a mistaken perception. The Catholic view acknowledges the suffering in the world, but it stops short of realizing that suffering is not the path to salvation. It is not through engaging with suffering or striving to endure it that you reach the ultimate peace. The way out of suffering is through the realization that the world is not real, that it is a dream constructed by your own mind. The true peace you seek is found not by enduring pain or finding meaning in hardship, but by letting go of the world entirely and recognizing that it was never truly real. The idea of a vale of tears reflects the illusion that suffering has a purpose. But the truth is that suffering is unnecessary, and it is only sustained by the belief in separation from God. As long as you identify with the world and see it as your reality, you will continue to suffer. But when you recognize that the world is a dream, you can let go of the attachment to it and experience the eternal peace that transcends all suffering. In this view, ACIM would agree with the Catholic sentiment that the world is full of suffering, but it would take it a step further by emphasizing that suffering is not only something to be endured, it is something to be seen through. The Catholic vale of tears metaphor might be used as a point of common ground, but ACIM would insist that the reason for this suffering is the belief in separation, and that the way to overcome it is to let go of attachment to the material world entirely. On the other hand, the Urantia Book would likely see this view as a misinterpretation of the nature of suffering and the material world. It might argue that suffering is indeed part of the human condition, but that it serves a necessary and purposeful role in the soul's evolution. It would claim that, rather than being a veil to be discarded or transcended, the material world and its challenges are an essential aspect of God's plan for spiritual growth. Urantia. The Catholic notion of the vale of tears points to the reality of human suffering, but it fails to appreciate the divine purpose behind it. Suffering, in the Urantia Book's view, is not a mistake or an illusion to be transcended, but a part of the necessary evolutionary process through which souls grow. It is not by rejecting the world that you achieve spiritual progress, but by engaging with it and overcoming its trials. The world you experience, with all its complexities and challenges, is a divinely crafted environment that supports the soul's ascent toward God. Suffering has a meaning, a divine purpose. It is not something to be ignored or discarded. It is an opportunity for growth, for learning, and for spiritual transformation. Just as pain is a signal of bodily injury, suffering in the material world signals the soul's need for growth and healing. It is through facing suffering that individuals develop compassion, wisdom, and a deeper connection to the divine plan. The idea that suffering is simply an illusion to be escaped from is a denial of the deep spiritual truths embedded in human experience. So, while ACIM would use the veil of tears metaphor to argue that the world and suffering are illusions to be transcended, the Urantia Book would counter that suffering has a deeper, meaningful purpose in the soul's evolution, and that trying to escape or deny it is a spiritual misunderstanding. ACIM and the Urantia Book would certainly offer very different perspectives on the proper way to engage with life and seek spiritual growth. Let's look at how each would frame the approach to life and spiritual progress. ACIM's view on spiritual growth. For ACIM, spiritual growth is fundamentally about shifting one's perception and moving from a mindset of separation to one of unity. Since ACIM holds that the material world is illusory, it emphasizes the importance of seeing beyond the physical reality and recognizing the truth of the non-dual, unified nature of existence. Here's how ACIM might describe the proper way to engage with life. ACIM. The proper way to engage with life is to recognize that it is an illusion. Your true reality is spirit, and the world of form, what you perceive with your senses, is not real. The purpose of life is not to make the world a better place or to achieve personal success, but to undo the belief in separation. You must forgive the world, for it is the projection of your mind. You forgive not because others have wronged you, but because you have created them in your mind and can choose to see them differently. Spiritual growth involves undoing the ego's grip on your perception. The ego tells you that the world is real, that you are separate, and that the body and mind are your true identity. But this is a mistake. The proper engagement with life is to recognize it as a dream, a projection, and to shift your focus to the truth that God is the only reality. When you forgive the illusion and let go of your attachment to the world, you awaken to the peace of God. Spiritual growth is about recognizing that you are not your body or your mind, you are spirit. You are already one with God, and your job is to awaken to that truth. In this view, spiritual growth is a process of realization and correction of perception, rather than action in the material world. ACIM emphasizes forgiveness as the key practice, not of others' wrongdoings, but of the false beliefs about separation that the mind holds. ACIM suggests that true spiritual growth involves letting go of attachment to the material world and seeing it for what it truly is, an illusion of the ego. The Urantia Book's view on spiritual growth. In contrast, the Urantia Book offers a much more complex and multi-layered approach to spiritual growth, deeply rooted in both the material and spiritual world. It focuses on the idea that human beings are evolving in both body and spirit, and that the material world plays a necessary role in this development. Here's how the Urantia Book might describe the proper way to engage with life. Urantia. The proper way to engage with life is to understand that you are a part of a divine plan. Life on earth is not a mistake, nor is it a realm to be rejected. You are a spiritual being on a journey of soul evolution, and the material world is a necessary environment for this development. Spiritual growth occurs through your engagement with the world around you, through the experiences you have, the relationships you form, and the challenges you face. The world is a stage upon which your soul can grow. To grow spiritually, you must engage with the world in a purposeful way. This means taking responsibility for your actions, cultivating a loving and compassionate heart, and striving for wisdom. It is not enough to retreat from life or to ignore the challenges it presents. True spiritual progress requires you to learn from your experiences, overcome difficulties, and evolve through them. The divine plan for you is to achieve soul perfection and eventually ascend to higher realms of existence. This process is gradual and requires patience, dedication, and the practice of virtues such as love, service, and truth. You must seek the will of God not by rejecting the world, but by engaging with it in a way that reflects God's love and purpose. The material world is not the ultimate reality, but it is an essential part of your journey toward perfection. In this view, spiritual growth is a process of engagement with the material world. It emphasizes living with purpose, developing virtues, and facing life's challenges with wisdom and love. The Urantia Book sees the material world as a necessary training ground for spiritual growth, and it advocates for an active participation in life, rather than attempting to escape or dismiss it. It recognizes that the world is not perfect, but that it is within this imperfect world that human beings evolve and come to understand their divine nature. Comparison: how each view sees the proper approach to life. ACIM: spiritual growth comes through recognizing the illusory nature of the material world and shifting perception to see the world as a dream. Engaging with life is about recognizing the world as an illusion, forgiving the belief in separation, and focusing on the realization of oneness with God. It's a more introspective, mind-focused approach to growth that involves undoing false beliefs and seeing beyond the material world. The Urantia Book: spiritual growth comes through engaging with the material world and learning from life's experiences. It sees the world as a valuable tool for soul development, where challenges and relationships are opportunities to grow in love, wisdom, and service. Spiritual progress involves aligning with divine purpose and taking responsibility for one's actions in the material world. What would each say about suffering and life's challenges? ACIM: suffering is seen as a result of the belief in separation from God. It is not to be engaged with but transcended by recognizing its illusory nature. Life's challenges are to be seen as projections of the mind that can be corrected through forgiveness and the realization of oneness. The Urantia Book: suffering is viewed as part of the evolutionary process. It is a necessary part of learning and growing spiritually. Life's challenges are seen as opportunities to develop virtues such as patience, compassion, and wisdom. Spiritual growth occurs through facing and overcoming difficulties, rather than avoiding or rejecting them. Summary: ACIM promotes spiritual growth by transcending the world and realizing that it is an illusion. It advocates for focusing on the mind, undoing false beliefs, and seeking inner peace through the recognition of oneness with God. The Urantia Book encourages spiritual growth through active engagement with the world, embracing challenges, and seeking to align one's actions with divine purpose. It emphasizes the importance of the material world in the soul's evolution and sees life as a training ground for higher spiritual realities. Both offer paths to spiritual growth but differ greatly in how they view the relationship between the material world and spiritual development.